armed and dangerous and good. That's what we're going to talk about today on Alpha Male Podcast. The podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, made in the image of God, strong, dominant, in control. And we don't apologize for that. I'm going to put in the bio to establish some credibility with the topic du jour, and then we'll get into it. Blessed to have served in military, law enforcement, combat veteran, private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that He got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Let's dive into the podcast. The reason for this topic today is because so much in today's culture and society tries to neuter men, both literally and spiritually and mentally. So much in today's culture and society tries to strip men of many attributes, but a chief one that they've tried to remove is violence, aggression. As if somehow that's bad, as if that's malum in se, evil by nature. It is not. Now, I'll totally concede that it can be abused, but lots of things are abused. That doesn't make them bad in and of themselves. Food and the consumption of food can be abused. You see that very clearly in our culture and society today. That doesn't make food bad. Without it, you would die. Right, so something can be abused, but that doesn't make the thing in and of itself bad. Violence, aggression, being dangerous, being armed. If those things at all hit you as negative, I would say you have been infected by this modern, wishy-washy, beta male, neutered, nerf, gender identity confused culture. None of those things are negative or bad. A good man can be violent, can be aggressive at the right times in the right situations, and it's a good thing if used properly. If you are out camping, now I live in the mountain wild west. There are grizzly bears here, in the state that I'm in. If I'm out camping and a grizzly bear literally claws open the tent and grabs my wife by the jaws, would it not be beneficial to my wife to have an aggressive, armed, violent man in that situation? Or the rollover beta male, I don't really want to be aggressive. Hey there, Mr. Grizzly Bear, could you just not eat my wife? That's not cool. I mean, that's even going above a microaggression. Could you stop that? Or if you could just wait, maybe I could pull up the internet and buy my way out of this, or find some non-violent solution to this problem. Is that a good man in that situation? Or is a good man one that's armed and dangerous and aggressive and will take decisive, violent action against that threat? You might think, well, I don't live in grizzly bear country. Okay. You know what's more dangerous than a grizzly bear? An intelligent human being that wants to kill another human being. More dangerous than any wild animal. Most people live, in people hives and subdivisions and suburbs and on a cul-de-sac, in cul-de-sac. Say this time you've got a wife and kids, and somebody kicks down your door, not for stuff, because they want to take your wife and children and use them and destroy them. trying to keep this family friendly, but painting a very graphic picture. That stuff happens all the time. Don't fall into the "I never thought it would happen to me" fallacy. I heard that all the time when I was a cop, to the point where I got jaded to it. Like, why? Why did you think it would never happen to you? Just because you didn't want it to? There's lots of things I don't want that happen all the time. Look up the statistics of like home residential fires and home invasions. This stuff happens. If somebody breaks into your house to destroy you and then use your wife, your loved one, your children's bodies without their consent, and then destroy them, what kind of man do you want in that scenario? Oh yeah, no, I mean, we live in a culture, a society. Just call the cops. When that person's done doing whatever they're going to do in 2 minutes, and the cops show up 45 minutes later, you can say, "Oh, it wasn't my fault. I'm just I would never want to hurt a fly." Or do you want the man that, again, will respond with decisive, aggressive, violent action? It's only because we live in this strange time in culture and society where many men can put their head in the sand. Or more literally, they can choke themselves with a tie and a nice clean white shirt and spend 8 hours a day in a cubicle or behind a desk and never ever use violence. And as by financial terms, maybe even do pretty well. And culture and society will pat them on the back. Good for you. Being a good little, stay in your lane. Always giving way to whatever's politically correct. Not making any waves. Not even speaking harshly. Good for you. Good for you. Aren't you a happy little beta male? Aren't you a good little boy? But that's a very strange and queer, meaning strange, preposterous, ridiculous, artificial construction of what man normally deals with. And the only reason some men sometimes get away with this is because there are armed, violent men acquainted with violence that stand at the gates to fight evil. So don't pretend that you're somehow morally superior because you're not willing to get your hands dirty. This baffles me like the so-called vegans, vegetarians, whatever. If you don't want to eat meat, that's on you. You're a free human being to do whatever or not do whatever kind of things like that you want. But don't pretend you're morally superior. Because I go out in the wilderness with a weapon and slay a beast and put meat on the table, and I don't apologize for it. Violent? Yes. Savage? Yes. Delicious? Yes. Nutritious? Yes. Those aren't mutually exclusive things. It's a moral ridiculousness to think that a vegetarian is somehow morally superior, or a vegan, if you want to take it to the extreme. What do you eat? A plant? Well, that's food that would have went to an animal if you hadn't eaten it. Also, if it's anything like bread, grain, cereal crops, which is a big chunk of modern culture and society's calories, right? That doesn't grow unless a farmer plants a field, tends it, and keeps the animals off of it. Before that was a cornfield or a rice paddy, a soy field if you're probably eating tofu if you're a vegetarian, whatever. Before it was that thing, it was a wild natural environment. Guess what those farmers did? They killed the animals that were there and planted food so you could eat it. And they continue to kill those animals, otherwise they would destroy their crops. I've managed a ranch. Never been a farmer, but it's because you live in such an insulated bubble that you believe that somehow you're morally superior without actually looking into it and thinking about how it works. If you're eating corn, that's because somebody killed the deer that were in that forest because it wasn't naturally a cornfield. And if you ever spend time in nature, resources can be scarce. Even if you only ate food that you foraged in the wild, which I love to go out and forage, that's a food source for animals. If I go out and slay an animal and eat it, how is that morally inferior to you going out and eating a food and then later in the winter that animal starves to death because you ate food that it would have eaten? Does that make you morally superior because I shot it and you let it starve to death? I don't think so. So don't be unwilling to use violence and then pretend you're morally superior for not using violence. I'm not even saying you have to use violence. I'm saying if you think that I am, or any other man that's violent, armed and dangerous, is morally inferior to you, that's a fallacy. Look at the ultimate authority of what's good and evil. Almighty God, the one who is good, the one who is love, for it is written, God is love. It is written, God is love. He defines what love is because he created love. He created everything. So, argue with me if you want, but look into it via God. What does he say? It is written, God is love. It is also written, the Lord is a man of war. Exodus 15. The Lord is a man of war. If we look at many men in the Bible, great men, not all. Like, I'm not saying that a man who uses violence is morally superior, but I'm saying you cannot make the case from a biblical perspective that it's morally inferior. At least not a good argument, in my opinion. David, a man after God's own heart. He was a mighty warrior. One of the reasons Saul, who was king, persecuted him and tried to kill him was because David, it was sung about, killed more men than him. He was a mighty warrior. He slayed beasts, lions, and bear. He slayed men tens of thousands. He slayed a giant and cut off its head with his own sword. That's violent. That's a man after God's own heart. Now, David was many other things too. He was a poet. He was a musician. He was a king. He was also a violent, aggressive, lethal warrior who knew how to wield violence. And Samson and Gideon. And you might think, well, those are, pre-Christ. And I would say, yeah, that's a good point. But Christ, even the best soldiers, even the best military, there are times when they're on non-violent missions. I was a Marine. I was deployed in combat, in war. There was also missions that I was on during the war that were non-violent, that were peacekeeping missions. That didn't make me a bad soldier. I knew when to use violence and when not to. Jesus does everything perfectly. He knows when to use violence and when not to. If we look at Paul, which wrote a big chunk of the New Testament, he says, be a good soldier for Christ. He uses that analogy. Be a good soldier for Christ. Soldiers, the reason soldiers exist is to be violent. A soldier that can't be violent, what is that? Right? When John the Baptist is approached by soldiers, he doesn't say stop being a soldier, that's a horrible profession. He doesn't say you should never ever be violent. No, he says be a good soldier. Don't defraud. Don't take more than is owed to you. He doesn't tell them to lay down their arms and go put on a tie. And now obviously this didn't exist back then. I'm being a bit ridiculous. But he doesn't say go put on a tie and stand in a cubicle and don't even use any microaggressions. Right? That's not what he says. He says, no, if you're going to be a soldier, be a good one. Paraphrasing. Be a good soldier. Likewise, Paul says, be a good soldier for Christ. He uses that, to be fair, as a metaphor. But soldiers are violent. And here's a verse that came from Jesus' own mouth. Maybe you don't hear it preached from the pulpit very often. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Jesus tells his disciples to have swords. Swords are not used. You can use a sword for a lot of things. You can hammer a nail with a sword. He didn't tell them to have hammers. You can cut bread with a sword, but it's probably easier with a knife. It says sword, and the word is sword, and a sword is a weapon made for violence. Now, Jesus also warns the disciples later about using them improperly at the wrong time. He doesn't tell them to put them throw them away, cast them away. How foolish is it to be armed and dangerous? No. It says, return your sword to its sheath. He doesn't tell them to never ever use it. Just use it at the right time. And that's part of, I'd say it's an equal abuse of violence to never use it and to overuse it. A good man is one that can wield violence, is acquainted with violence, and can use it controllably, can control when he uses violence and aggression at the right time in the right way for the right reasons. Like many other things, food, alcohol, human reproduction, it can be used responsibly for glory and to glorify. It can be used to the glory of Almighty God and to benefit His creation, or it can be abused to the detriment of those things. But it's not malamente, it's not evil by nature. God's angels carry swords. Not the bad ones, the good ones. I don't know if the bad ones do or not. I haven't done a deep biblical dive into that. I can't think of any cases where the evil ones carry swords, but I can think of where the good angels carry swords. The Lord is a man of war. His created beings that are good are armed. And I think just like this beta male pacifism has crept into our culture, sadly, it's also crept into Christian culture. Now, you could be super into Christian culture, love Christian rock, and even go to church all the time. That doesn't make you a Christian. If you look at it from a true biblical perspective, a servant of God and a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm not saying you have to be violent and armed and aggressive, but I'm saying there's no contradiction between being a violent, armed, aggressive man and being a man of God. We look at many, and I'm sure certainly every man except for Jesus Christ who ever lived was flawed in some way or another, but many of the mighty heroes that we have were also Christian, violent Christian men. You look at Constantine. He was a man of war. He was a mighty military leader. Not only did he convert, and his mother convert, and his family convert, largely the Roman Empire converted due to him. And it wasn't because he was some wishy-washy beta male that sat down and sucked his thumb in battle. He was a mighty man of war. His men respected him as a warrior. He was a military leader. A little bit closer to home, George Washington. Or how about the Pilgrims who came here to follow God the way they thought was the right and proper way, not in a perverse way that had become in contemporary Christian culture, but get back to the core, fundamental being a Christian. They hacked their way in the wilderness. They had bloody, violent encounters. Some of them, to be fair, like the Quakers that were a small sect, were nonviolent. But many of the Puritans were not. Look at the Black Robe Regiment who fought in the Revolution. They were preachers who fought in the Revolution. Look at the Vikings. And this is one of the things that kind of ticks me off about modern culture and stuff. There's been like a resurgence in people admiring Vikings. Vikings were great warriors. They started out pagan. And you don't see this touted a lot. But when they got confronted with... They were violent, ruthless men. But when they got confronted with the truth of the gospel, they converted. They gave up their pagan ways to become Christians. And that's not popular and hip in today's culture and society, but it's true. There's no getting around it. By and large, when these violent warrior men, when they saw the truth of Christ, they converted. They were still great warriors in the post-Christian Viking society. Some of the best were Christian warriors that were Vikings. It wasn't the fact that they were pagans that made them great warriors. They were great warriors after they came to Christ. And they didn't get converted by the sword, but they were converted and still used the sword. Look into it for yourself. They were great Christian Viking warriors. Although it's sadly been forgotten about in many of these countries that came from a Viking heritage, many of their flags still bear the symbol of Christianity. Violent warrior Christian men. And how about the Knights Templar? Not talking about some stupid conspiracy theory thing. I'm talking about the actual Knights Templars who took vows of poverty and went and fought and died valiantly to rid the Holy Land of Islamic terrorists, which is what they were. They were killing Christians and Jews in the Holy Land. They were nasty, disgusting Islamic terrorists. And mighty Christian warriors fought against them. The Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights. Go look into those. Mighty men of war who were Christians. Look at William Marshall. And certainly he was a flawed man, because all men except for Jesus Christ are flawed. But arguably the greatest knight who ever lived. Right? These men left largely fortunes and land and a life of privilege. Not for fame, not for glory, not for money. They had money in Europe, in England, in Germany, in France. They had money there. They gave it up to go fight and die in the Holy Land as Christian warriors to stand up and do what was right. I think we need a little bit more of that in our contemporary culture today. Mighty, strong men who know how to wield violence and aggression in the right way at the right time. I think we need more of that in our culture and society today, not less. And I guess that kind of is a good summation of today's episode as a whole. Men, I appreciate you listening. I hope this podcast, not because I'm anything special, but because God chooses to use it, makes it a shining light in a dark and perverse world. Don't be afraid to get out there and let your light shine. Be the man you were created and called to be. And don't shy away from it. Don't back down from it. And don't apologize for being a strong, dominant Christian man. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.